MPs are preparing to debate a motion calling for an inquiry into the government's handling of the Iraq War and its aftermath. Well, joining us now, one of those MPs, the Respect Party's MP, George Galloway. Mr. Galloway, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Sitting in that chair, what, an hour or so ago, Dennis McShane was saying, we don't need another inquiry, we've had inquiries already. All another inquiry would do is secure lots of cheap political point scoring. What do you think of that?
Well, in the famous words of Mandy Rice Davis, he would say that, wouldn't he? Because he's one of the people whose conduct would have to be investigated. The entire government is jointly and severally responsible for a disaster, a military disaster of the kind suffered by Napoleon at Moscow and Hitler in Operation Barbarossa when he attacked the Soviet Union, a political disaster, the worst political disaster our country has suffered for probably 100 years since the Boer War, and with much more significance. So the stakes are very high for people like Dennis McShane to try and cover their tracks until they can get out of office unsacked, as it were.
But isn't the great problem, and people will appreciate that sweep of history which you've just given us, but one of the defining characteristics of those battles that you mentioned, those debacles that you mentioned, is that we've had time to assess whether they did anything good or did anything bad. And the problem here is, and you had one general writing about this over the weekend, that you can look at something like the Malayan emergency and recognise that it took something like a decade for the Brits to get themselves together, to get organised enough to learn how to deal with an insurgency. It's only 3 or 4 years, 3.5 years since March 2003. The Americans will say, look, we've had successful elections, 60% of Iraqis turned out and voted. That's as good as, say, a British general election. There are nightmarish scenes, admittedly, but in some areas it's going better than some expected.
I'm not sure what areas those would be.
Well, I could go through a couple if you like.
Yes?
Well, for instance, Saddam was saying when he used to be in charge, there were no free television channels. Now 60% of Iraqis have got satellite television. You might not think that's a good thing, but they've got a free press now, for instance. They've got free elections. Nobody's saying that life is good in Iraq, far from it. But it's wrong, surely, to paint the picture as completely bleak.
But 655,000 Iraqis have been killed.
According to one report.
Well, according to the Johns Hopkins University, one of the most respected universities in the United States of America, and the Lancet, one of the most respected journals in Britain, you could take your pick whether to believe Mr. Blair's denial or Johns Hopkins and the Lancet. Most people would choose the latter, I can assure you about that. Thousands of our own soldiers, American and British, have been killed. Tens of thousands have been wounded and maimed. And our own soldiers are telling you, including the top soldier, is telling you that our presence in Iraq is exacerbating the situation. We should get out soon. And that it has undoubtedly contributed to a reality of danger for British people and British interests around the world. And that's the difference between this and the Malayan emergency, for example. First of all, there were not more than 500,000 people dead in the Malayan emergency. And secondly, it did not have the international ramifications which this disaster has had. It spread extremism, fanaticism, hatred and bitterness throughout the Muslim world, which is 1.7 billion strong, and which has 2 million adherents in our own country. That division, that bitterness, has led to a situation where many people are out to hurt us and out to damage us, and the consequences of it are grave.
Nobody would deny elements of your analysis, for sure, but let's just talk specifically about the debate that we're going to see in the Commons today. Adam Price, he's Plaid Cymru's defence spokesman. He wrote in a newspaper, or was quoted in a newspaper this morning as saying, it's essential for the credibility of our democracy that we establish what combination of deception, delusion and ineptitude carried us down this fateful path. I suspect you may well agree with those words, but that's not the point.
Well,
let me just finish the question, which is that no government's going to set up an inquiry, an impartial, balanced inquiry, where the firing squad, according to Mr. Price, are already lined up.
Well, you say that, but the House of Commons once rose to the challenge and once lived up to its name. In the Norway debate, when after 3 days people put the country before the party, the war effort before the interests of the Prime Minister, Chamberlain was sacked, Churchill was installed, all as a result of a House of Commons debate and vote, and the whole history of the world was changed. I would not be here today if that had not been done. Somebody else would be here, and you'd be speaking in German, and I'd be replying in German. That's how important the stakes were on that day, and the House of Commons rose to that. Now, whether we have a parliament today that would do that must be in very great doubt, and I'm not predicting to you that the Prime Minister is going to lose the vote. But he's definitely lost the argument, and I suspect that you know that most people in the country now agree with me, and that everything I said about Iraq before the war has turned out to be right, and everything that Mr. Blair said about the war before it turned out to be wrong, except where it was deliberately a lie.
I don't know if you can reach into your trouser pocket and switch off your mobile phone if you've got one. It could be Channel 4 trying to get through to you about who knows, a new offer of a reality show. There you go. There are those who will say, what possible good would a public inquiry, any kind of inquiry, frankly, achieve? Because the Americans recognise they made mistakes, but they made them, and again, this is what some people will say, they made them in good faith. They sought to adopt a model that they adopted after the Second World War, denazification. They tried to strip out every trace of Baathism. Now, we can all say that was a disaster because, of course, that meant dismantling the police force, the security apparatus, the army, things that ought to have been kept in place. But it's done, it's happened, it's gone. What's the good of poring over the embers now when what many people need in Iraq is as much support from the West, psychologically as well as militarily and financially, as they possibly can muster?
Well, some might say that Mr. Bush acted in good faith, but not many. And not many in the United States, as you're going to find out in 7 days' time, where the Republican Party looks set to be on the end of the mother of all electoral beatings. So not many people accept that the Bush administration acted in good faith, not many even in the Republican Party anymore. And Mr. Blair continues to stand on that wicket, but he has fewer and fewer supporters, less and less enthusiastically. The reality is we should never have invaded and occupied Iraq. The basis for doing so was wholly wrong, except where it was deliberately fraudulent. There were no weapons of mass destruction, there was no link to Al-Qaeda, there was no connection to the atrocity on 9/11. The world has not been made safer. Terrorism has multiplied rather than been squashed. Everything that was predicted about the war by the anti-war movement has turned out to be right. It's time to have an inquiry to establish how such a gigantic blunder was made, not just because we need to change course on this, but because we have to avoid such a thing ever happening again. It's not asking too much, is it? A 7-man inquiry of privy councillors to look at the blunders of the worst policy disaster in 100 years. It's not asking for very much.
Let me tell you somebody who's already made up their mind without an inquiry. That's the veteran correspondent from the Middle East, Robert Fisk. We had him in here a couple of weeks ago. And he was saying, so far as he could tell, he'd reached the bleak assessment that many Iraqis, and you know Iraq well, had decided that they would actually prefer security and dictatorship rather than freedom and anarchy. Now, rightly or wrongly, and I'm merely reading comments that have been reported in the past, you have lavished, allegedly, blandishments on Saddam's regime. Do you think life would be better now under that dictatorship, under that totalitarian regime of terror run by Saddam Hussein?
Well, I have never lavished blandishments on Saddam Hussein's regime. In fact, I was one of the very few opponents of the Saddam Hussein regime when British ministers and businessmen... When British businessmen and ministers were going in and out of the Iraqi embassy doing business with them. So I'm sorry, I just won't have that.
Well, but you don't need to go spend very long on Google.
The more important point is whether or not Iraqis were better off before the war than they are now. Only a madman would say that they're better off now. For a start, 655,000 of them are no longer here. Thousands and thousands and thousands of them are in prison camps, God knows where. Bodies are turning up, 150 a day, in the mortuary with their tongues cut out and drill marks through their head. Nobody can walk safely on any street in Iraq. Millions have fled the country. The Americans have looted billions of dollars worth of Iraq's wealth. The idea that Iraq is better off today than it was before the war is simply absurd.
So you would prefer Iraq still to have Saddam Hussein?
That's not what I said.
No, well, that's the right question, isn't it? It's a simple question, yes or no.
That's not the choice, you see. That's not the choice. That's not the choice. The idea that Iraq is better off because of what Bush and Blair did is simply absurd. You only have to look at your own news broadcasts to see how stupid a statement that is.
It's not a statement, it's a question. It's a reasonable question, and it's
not
one
a
that we
reasonable
listen.
one.
It's one we put to Robert
You're the
Fisk.
last people asking it. Nobody else in the world is asking it. Everybody knows this war is a bloody disaster. Why don't you just accept it? Because your station, though admittedly not as bad as the BBC, was an essential component of this invasion. You regurgitated endlessly the propaganda. I've got the videos if you want me to show you them. Endlessly regurgitated the propaganda and talked the country into its worst disaster for 100 years. So have some humility and accept that you were wrong.
It's not a question of humility, Mr. Galloway. It's a question of simply asking simple questions.
Scott
I think
doesn't
most
do
of our
humility,
viewers would have appreciated a straightforward yes or no. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Interesting as ever talking to you. George Galloway in central London. Thank you.